I'm super excited to meet you all, and I got a glimpse at your questions too. So I know that you're an interesting, thoughtful group of people, and I'm a little sad I'm not in the room with you because I would be throwing many more questions at you if I was. But instead, I'm going to talk at you for some amount of time, and then we can open it up to questions and take it from there. So, without further ado, I'm going to give you a glimpse at my screen. And I usually start by asking this question, what is justice? Because it kind of gets to the heart of what I am interested in as a writer. I've been a criminal justice reporter for my entire career, which is now, in multiple decades of doing this. And it's certainly a big focus of the 57 bus. And so if you can kind of think to yourself, since I can't have you shout out answers, if you can kind of come up in your mind with a definition for what is justice, I think as you try and find the words, you might find that it's harder than you thought. We use this word justice all the time to talk about something, and then it turns out when you start to dig even a tiny bit into the concept that it's actually perplexing because we don't know what we mean most of the time. So when I first started this work as a criminal justice reporter, one of the very first stories that I ever did was about the death penalty. And what you see in that slide is the death chamber at San Quentin, not too far from Napa High School. And this was a big topic in the 1990s when I started out as a reporter, because executions were happening at San Quentin on the regular. This was just kind of a fact of life that the machinery of the death penalty was in full operation. And so the first piece that I did was a long feature about all the different people who were active in trying death penalty cases. The death penalty is the penalty phase. So in a capital murder case, which is a case where the death penalty is an option, there's first a trial stage, which is guilty, not guilty. And then there is a penalty phase, which is life or death. And so I was interested in the people whose job it was to try these cases. The judge, the defense lawyer, the prosecutor, all the people who were thinking about how to do their jobs within this system. What was that like to have the stakes be so high? So one of the first people that I interviewed was this guy named James Anderson, who was at that time the prosecutor in Alameda County, where Oakland is, who had the most death penalty convictions. That is the most cases where the jury had decided that the verdict in the penalty phase is death. And when I walked into his office, he had a bunch of pictures up on one wall. And when I went to look at the pictures, I saw that they were the mugshots of every person that he had gotten a death penalty conviction for. And I thought about that a lot afterwards because it was really clear that he saw this as kind of his trophy wall. These were his wins. And so for him, justice was somebody getting their just desserts, that in his view of the world, these men, and they were all men, were bad people. And his job was to remove them from the face of the earth so that the world would be safer. Now, I was also writing about people who were defense attorneys who had a pretty different view of the death penalty. But that idea of justice as being somebody getting their just desserts, their just consequence, I think is really important because whether or not you believe in the death penalty, it is a big part of how we think about justice in our society. So I like to show this little video because the story of justice is always being written, and how we look at justice at one moment is not necessarily how we will look at it in the future. What you're seeing here is that same death chamber being dismantled, which happened 2 years ago in the spring of 2019. This was by executive order of our current governor, Gavin Newsom, who placed a moratorium on the use of the death penalty in California. So there are no executions happening in California at this moment. And the reason is because there's a lot of evidence that the way the death penalty is administered in California and every state in the union is not fair. That depending on who you are and also who the victim of your crime is, you are more likely to be sentenced to death. So that is people of color, particularly Black and Latinos, are in California, and Native people in other states are more likely to be convicted and sentenced to death than white people for the same crime. And people whose victims are white are more likely to be sentenced to death than people whose victims are people of color, particularly Black, Latin, Latino, and Native. So given that we don't use this weapon, this consequence, the same way for everybody, we have a moratorium on executions in California. And for me, the importance of this video is that you, as young people who are going to go out into the world, are going to be writing the story of justice. You are the ones who are going to be deciding what justice actually is. And it is not static. It is something that we can make more just, however we decide that more justice is actually defined. So I've been doing this justice writing for a long time when I got this email. This is on November 4th, 2013, 8:38 p.m. You all have read the 57 bus, so you know that this is the day that the story begins. I live in the neighborhood where all of this took place. The 57 bus is the same bus that my kid took to his school. Sasha lives in my neighborhood. Oakland High School is my neighborhood high school. It was as local as it could be for me. And so I first heard about what happened on the 57 bus in this email, which came from my neighborhood listserv. And it said, that somebody was picking up their kids from school at the local elementary school, and they saw a whole bunch of Oakland police cars, Alameda sheriffs and ambulances at that intersection, which is where the bus pulled over after the fire. Now, I have to say that this particular email did not register in my mind at the moment that I received it, because I didn't know what was up. And there was, at that time, Oakland was leading the nation in strong arm robberies. And I assumed that somebody had been held up, and this being a kind of a regular occurrence, I didn't give it that much thought. But of course, there was much more to the story than that. And as this news came out about what had happened, that a young person named Sasha had been set on fire on the bus, and then that the person who had set the fire was a young person named Richard, who was 15 years old, I began to pay more and more attention to what was happening. And one of the things that particularly caught my attention was the fact that Richard was being charged as an adult. And so as somebody who wrote a lot about criminal justice, I knew that that was an unusual decision, that that's not how the juvenile system is supposed to work in those earlier versions of justice. And so I was curious, what was the law that said that the prosecutor could just decide to charge a young person as an adult? And so that was actually the first thing that I began investigating, was what is this thing? It's known as direct files. It is no longer the law in California, but it was then, and it was a law that had been passed in 2000, and which you read some about in the 57 bus. So as I watched my neighborhood discuss what had happened, and it wasn't just my neighborhood, it was also the email list for my kid's high school, Oakland Tech, which is a large public high school in Oakland that Richard had attended before he went to Oakland High School. And so the discussions were happening in all these different kind of places in town, and then on the news, and then everywhere I went, people were talking about it, that this terrible thing had happened, that this young person had done it. And I watched as people tried to make sense of it, pulling whatever they knew out of their brains to kind of make a story that made sense, which is what we do because we have these amazing brains as upper level primates. We have this ability to connect the dots, to make inferences, and take a piece of information and connect it to other things that we know, other stuff that we have in our brain. The only problem is that a lot of what's in our brain is trash. We have all kinds of stuff that is not fact checked in our brains. We have stories that we've heard, anecdotes, rumors. We have stuff we've seen in the media. We have stereotypes of all kinds. And so as people around me began to put together stories and narratives about what had happened, I saw a lot of stuff that didn't seem to be backed up by any evidence. So chief among those things was this notion that the kid who had set the fire, Richard, was a monster. And that was very much how people saw him, as somebody who was irredeemable. And there were lots of posts on my neighborhood email list about this kid, we should lock this kid up and throw away the key. Because obviously somebody who had done something at age 16 that was so horrifying was irredeemable. So I had a lot of questions. And one of the things I wanted to know was who were each of these young people and how did they get to that moment on the bus? And I thought to myself that maybe I could tell a different story, something different from what I was seeing on the evening news, in the newspapers, in all of these online discussions, et cetera. So I'm just going to stop for a moment and give you a quick overview of kind of what I do as a journalist. The reporter's job is to report the facts. And there's a lot of different kinds of reporters. I am not a news reporter in the traditional sense. I'm not a television reporter at all, which is what people tend to think of when they hear reporter. I'm a print reporter. And I don't write for a daily newspaper. I write for magazines. So the people who are reporting the news as it happens have a very particular job, which is to share whatever information they can gather and with a very, very short time frame. That's not me. I have the benefit of time. And so I come to watch stories unfold over a long period of time and try and get to the story behind the story. And so I have a lot of criticisms of how this story was covered, some of which you saw on the 57 bus. But I always want to say that the job of those reporters is very difficult because the truth is that finding out true answers takes a lot of time. So part of what I have kind of in my back pocket is that I always say, I'll still be there when all the other reporters have left. And that was very true for this story. It started out being like a scrum of reporters trying to get into the courtroom where Richard's first hearings were, people literally like jockeying for position. And then at the end, I was the only person there. And so that's something that my secret weapon is patience. But you, as media consumers, probably don't have a lot of patience. You want to know the answer right away. So one of the things that I ask myself is, who do I need to talk to? Who can give me sort of the story behind the story, the true story, the story with more nuance, more information, more backstory. Another thing that I'm always trying to figure out is, can I pin down the facts? Because people will tell you lots of things that may or may not be true. But for me, they are only true if I can find the evidence to back them up. And so there are lots of things that people can feel, and I can report that those are the feelings, but I can't report that those are the facts. Which brings me to this question of being objective, because that's my job as a reporter, is to not come at you with my opinions, to back these up, to get to the bottom of things and find the things that are solid, that I know are true. At the same time, I am not, nobody is objective. So I'm always looking at the story through the context of my own experience, as everybody else is. And so one of the things that I'm trying to control for and kind of hold back is my own emotions, my own desires to make the story into something that fits whatever trash I have floating around in my head. I do that by having almost enhanced subjectivity. So I'm trying to be objective and to have true facts, but I'm also trying to be subjective and empathic and to talk to people about their experience and how they are viewing these events. And I believe that by having more subjectivity, you can compensate for the ways in which you might miss the story if you're only reporting the things that you can touch. So objectivity and subjectivity are both part of my job, and I never want to say that one is more important than the other. We live in a time of a lot, fake news and a lot of things that aren't fact checked. So facts are more important than ever, but so also is trying to understand different people's perspective on those facts. So what did I want to know? At this very, very beginning stage, I had heard two words used to describe these young people. Sasha was being described as agender, and Richard was being described as homophobic. And at that point, just starting out, I didn't know anything about either one of these kids. So these were really not facts for me yet, because I had not yet confirmed them. So how do you confirm a fact? Oh, one other thing. They were both being described as adults. And that was another thing that I was interested in. Sasha was being called an adult because they were over 18 at the time of the fire. And Richard was being called an adult because he was being charged as an adult. So for the purposes of the legal system, he was considered to be an adult. And so I had a lot of questions about this word adult and how do we determine whether a young person is a child or an adult? What is the bright line that brings you from one category to another? So how do I go about verifying things? On your left, you'll see the Declaration in Support of Probable Cause. This is the document that the district attorney files when filing charges against someone. You'll see under A and B, those are the two criminal code sections that relate to the two serious felonies that Richard was charged with. On the right, you'll see something that's called an enhancement. So hate crimes are not a separate crime. What they are is they are an enhancement, which means that you are, if convicted, will get a more serious punishment, that is a longer sentence of incarceration if you are found to have done whatever you did motivated by hate. So a lot of times people throw around this word hate crime as if to mean that it's a separate crime. It is not. It is simply more time on your sentence. So why was it a hate crime? Anwan Jones, who was the officer, one of those two police officers who interviewed Richard, wrote, the suspect stated he did it because he was homophobic. So that was where this word came from the police interview. Is this a fact? All I can say that I know is factually true is according to the Oakland Police Department, according to the charging documents, Richard did it because he was homophobic. So I can say that that is what is being alleged, but I don't know. I haven't talked to Richard. I don't know even in a lifetime of interviews how you can actually determine for sure what is inside somebody's head unless they tell you. So at this point, all I know is that that is the allegation. On your right, you're going to see Carl and Debbie. Those are Sasha's parents. And they were the source of this word, agender. And at this point in 2013, this was a new term for me. I actually had no idea that there were more than two genders. And so I was like, that's interesting. And is this true about Sasha? Well, it is according to their parents. But I write a lot about young people. And if I were to ask your parents something about you and a deeply personal thing about your identity, I might get a factual answer and I might not. Kind of depends on what your relationship with your parents is. So at this point, all I can say is, according to Sasha's parents, they are agender. And it wasn't until I had a chance to meet with Sasha and interview them that I could say, for sure, this is Sasha's gender. So Sasha's gender, of course, is a big focus of the story that I wrote for the New York Times, which is where I first wrote this. It was a big part of the story of that was in the mainstream media, on the nightly news, et cetera. And it's a big part of the book. But of course, it's not the whole story of Sasha. Sasha's story is about all the things that make them a unique person. Their love of languages and the fact that they invented languages for fun, their love of games of all kinds and webcomics and the color purple and everything having to do with Russia and the Soviet Union. All of those things are part of Sasha's story. But of course, Sasha's gender is also part of their story. I am very fond of this particular graphic, which I think breaks things down in a nice, easy to digest way. And these are all things that I went through in the book about Sasha's gender identity, which is how they feel inside, their gender expression, which was wearing skirts, their sex assigned at birth, which is what often we use interchangeably with gender, even though it's a separate thing, who they are physically attracted to, and who they are emotionally attracted to. Sasha, you'll remember, gender identity is agender, that is not male, not female, but occupying this other space. Gender expression, skirts, physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to, Sasha had very specific words for. They are on the asexual spectrum, meaning that they don't have a lot of physical attraction or sexual feelings. So they call themselves gray cupiosexual, meaning that they live in this kind of gray area between having sexual feelings and sexual interest and not, and cupio meaning curious. So curious to know more about sex. And qua romantic meaning that they didn't see a big distinction between romantic and platonic love. They just felt love. Also pansexual meaning and panromantic meaning attracted and emotionally and physically to people across the gender spectrum. So Sasha had a loving and supportive family, and a loving and supportive school community and loving and supportive friends. And they were part of the larger world, the larger community. And that is a dangerous place for gender nonconforming people. You'll see here some statistics. Those come from the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. And I think the key one is well, they're all key. The fact that 3/4 of transgender youth have experienced harassment at school is of particular importance to you as people who attend a school. The fact that 1 out of every 4 trans people and 1 out of every 3 non-binary people have experienced a bias-driven assault. Assault means somebody has actually put their hands on you. That I think is very key for this particular story in which Sasha experienced a bias-driven assault. And I'm just going to asterisk bias-driven assault for you because obviously you've read the book, you know that Richard is a complicated person and Richard's motivations were complicated, but I never want to look away from the fact that of all the people on the bus, Richard and his friends selected Sasha. What is Richard's story? You see Richard there with his younger brother, Darian. And Richard, just like Sasha, is much more than any particular identity marker or the fact that he committed this shocking crime. Richard at that time was living with his mother, his stepfather, his younger brother. and two cousins who were more like sisters. They had moved in with the family after their mother was murdered. He was known for practical joking, for being a true and loyal friend, and he was working very hard to get his life together after having been sent away to a group home for 14 months for getting in trouble for fighting. While he was there, this major thing had happened, which is that his best friend had been murdered. And I first learned about this when I watched the video of the interview with the police. And I heard him say, my best friend since forever, my best friend ever, he passed. And I had a little breakdown. And instantly, my life as a reporter in Oakland and my life really as a citizen of Oakland kind of became relevant, because I had some sense of what that meant. The fact, that his friend had been murdered, unfortunately, is not an uncommon story in Oakland. And having been a reporter here in the 1990s, when Oakland was one of the leading places in the country for murder, I had seen this story unfold over now 2 generations. So what you see there, R.I.P. Skeet, that's the sidewalk memorial for Skeet on Hagenberger Road, where he was gunned down. And sometimes I didn't put the slide in today, but there's a memorial in Oakland for all the young people who have died violent deaths. It's a big slab of marble that has names on it. And, it's now on the second side. Skeet's name is on the second side of it. And so this is kind of this slow motion massacre that's happening of young people in Oakland and in many, many places where there is gun violence. This is kind of a national story, not just a story here. And so Richard, much as Richard is trying to be in charge of writing his own story, is also part of a larger story, a story in which Black kids are 10 times more likely to be the victims of gun violence than white kids, and where they're also more than 4 times as likely to be incarcerated as white kids for the same crime. And like Richard, 58% of Black youth do their time in an adult prison. So the peril that Richard was facing of possibly doing his time, being sentenced to go into an adult prison, which was the stakes if he were sentenced to longer than that 5 years, that was on the table. If he was sentenced to longer than that, he would have had to do all of his time in an adult prison. So the last thing before I open this up to a question that I want to talk to you about is, in the book, in 57 Bus, they're kind of, you see these as 2 stories, 2 identity issues, if you will, one about gender and one about race. And what I want to point out to you is that they're really the same story, that a society, a culture, a world in which people are marginalized, are under the threat of violence, are facing peril at every turn because of who they are, is a society that is dangerous for everybody. And so this is a new study that just came out this month about TikTok, where I spend far too much of my time, and maybe some of you do as well. What the study did, the authors created a TikTok account. They used it only to interact with transphobic content. That is only with videos that did things like make fun of trans people or argue that there are only 2 genders. And what happened as they did that was that the algorithm began to feed them more and more extreme content. So they began to see more misogynistic, that is anti-woman videos, more racist, white supremacist, anti-vaccine, anti-Semitic, ableist, conspiracy theories, hate symbols, and explicit calls to violence, particularly against LGBTQ plus people, but also against people in some of these other categories, against Black people, against immigrants, against Jews, and so on. And so transphobia is a sort of a gateway prejudice that you go into this room, and then it just leads you down this hallway into all these other places. And so the importance of this to you is, I think, twofold. One is that I want you to pay attention to what you're interacting with online, because there are a lot of people out there putting a lot of nasty stuff out there, and they are delighted to get you involved. And they get you involved generally through humor. And so your job as a media consumer is to think carefully about what the agenda is of people who are feeding you stuff. And the other is to understand that it's all connected, that all of these ways of dehumanizing people are linked, and that all of us are dehumanized by them. So, does your definition of justice change if you know the whole story? If you know Richard, if you know Sasha, if you know the story of the ways in which these different kinds of experiences have pressed down upon the story, so that Richard and Sasha, who are trying to write their own story, have also to deal with the fact that society has another story for them. Does that change your definition of justice? It changed mine when I began to think about it. And so one of the definitions that I really love comes from this guy, Howard Zehr, who is active in the restorative justice movement. And he says, if crime is a wound, justice should be healing. And that, to me, is what I want to get close to as I think about justice, is how do we get to a place where it feels like justice has been done for everyone, and we can move on without being shaped by a terrible thing that happened.
Wow, thank you so much, Ms. Slater. That was an amazing deep dive into not only the process of your authorship, but of the meaning behind that work. And I know that we've acknowledged that students have some great questions, so we'll jump right into those if that's okay with you.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cassie's here, and we were starting with number 1. Oh, start with Kathy? Yeah, but I think because she's right here. Okay. Go ahead, Robert.
Question number 2. Nice and loud.
For the first question, while learning about Richard's and Sasha's stories, what was the hardest thing to hear about and then write about?
Yeah, so great question. So the question is, what was the hardest thing to hear about and write about? One of the hardest things, and there were many hard things. It was a hard book to write and a really hard book to report. I had to watch the video of the incident on the bus over and over and over again. The way that the cameras work is this was an extra long bus. I think there were 16 cameras on the bus. And so all recording things from different perspectives. And when I got the recordings, they were in a grid of those 16 views, so you can watch them simultaneously, or you can click on one and watch a particular camera's view. In order to understand what had happened on the bus, I had to watch from every perspective, from all 16 views. And then I watched many of those views many times in order to really be able to see what everybody was doing, what the dialogue was. And obviously I knew what was coming. And so that was really hard, was to watch those over and over again, watch that really terrible event. It was also I spent time in the burn unit where Sasha was, and learning about what happens during when somebody's been badly burned. I'm super squeamish, so that was really hard for me to write that.
Okay, question number 2.
When reading chapters like Reunion in the interview part 1, you included lots of details. For example, in the chapter Reunion, you described how Sasha was taking a while to come out of their bedroom to meet Dan and Gail. Also in the chapter, the interview part 1, you described Richard's holding cell in very fine detail. So I was wondering, how did you get all those thorough details? Were you present during that time, and why were they important?
I love this question because this is where I get to sort of talk about my process, which of course is like most of what I do is trying to get those details and figure out how to communicate them to you. So one of the ways that I differ from like a daily newspaper reporter or a news reporter is that I am trying to make something that reads as much like a novel as possible. I want to make you feel like you were there. And in this particular book, I was there for a lot of things. I started reporting a few days after Richard's arrest, and I followed the story all the way to its conclusion. So I was there for most of the court hearings, for many of the things that people did, including that meeting with Dan Gale. And that was actually the first thing that I was there for. Right after Sasha's family agreed to work with me, they said, Sasha's going to meet Dan and Gail for the first time over at our house. Do you want to join? And so I sat there and was a fly on the wall for that whole meeting and scribbling away on my notes to what's happening at that moment. So all those details about how nervous Dan was and moving his feet and the conversation about what to do, all those things were things that I was there for. And while I was there, my brain is thinking, how do I capture what this is like? I was not there when Richard was first booked in. So what I did was I contacted the warden for the juvenile facility in Alameda County, and I asked if he would give me a tour and if he would book me in, as if the way that Richard would have been booked in. And so that all those details came from having somebody just walk me through that whole process. So being there and going through and looking at what everything looked like and what the order of events would have been, and then having the staff tell me things that usually happen. So all that stuff about like who they put in a holding cell and how they make sure that two people are fighting, don't go to the same holding cell, like those kinds of things were all from interviews with staff. So why are they important? They're important both because I want you to know what it was like, and because certain details feel telling to me. One of the themes of the book is this question of what justice is and what it's like. And all the ways in which the justice system feels dehumanizing are things that I really wanted you to feel. Also, I felt like as young people, if you had never interacted with the criminal justice system, you were probably pretty curious about what it's like. So that's another reason that that's in there.
In your opinion, what is the idealist justice system for teenagers? During the book, you talked a lot about the system and how corrupt it is. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
So this question is about like, what is the ideal justice system for teenagers? And I just I'll start by saying, I don't know. That this is constantly being redefined for me. The more reporting I do on justice, the more I learn, the more I'm, I feel like it's, like that thing where you can, always get close to a point if you get halfway there, but you can never actually get there. That's what justice is for me, is something that we're always approaching. After the book came out, I talk about restorative justice in the book, and but I started getting a lot of questions about it, and I was like, everything I know is actually in the book. And then someone that I swim with actually invited me to the first meeting of an experiment that she was trying. She worked with incarcerated people in Solano State Prison, and she was starting a restorative justice circle for formerly incarcerated people who had just been released, lifers, so people who had served extremely long sentences and had been paroled. and never incarcerated people. So the idea was that it was going to be this restorative justice circle, a community building circle that was two groups of people who often don't interact: incarcerated, never incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, never incarcerated. So through that community, which ended up being a huge part of my life, I have spent a lot of time talking about justice and restorative justice in particular, learning from men who learned how to be restorative justice circle leaders while in prison. And what I have heard from them, without exception, is if they had had restorative justice when they were teenagers, their lives would have taken a very different turn. And so to me, when I look back at my own early years, I certainly can think of all the dumb stuff I did, the hurtful stuff I did, the times I got in trouble, the times I didn't get in trouble, but probably should have. And obviously, like, I did better maybe it's not obvious, but I got older, I learned how to do better. And so to me, the key thing about being a young person is that you are a work in progress, and you will absolutely, without a question, screw up. You will do things of which you are not proud, and you will do things that hurt other people, hopefully not physically, but certainly emotionally. And so how do you take that experience and use it to become a person who is less likely to do those things in the future? Restorative justice, to me, is one way that can happen, by cultivating relationships so that you feel not that your school is against you, your teachers are against you, your community is against you, but that all of us are rooting for you and want you to do well.
Hi, I'm Denise. The way you write about Sasha and Richard feels like you connected to their story. What inspired you to write this book and the way you did?
So the question is, what inspired me to write the story of Richard and Sasha in the way that I did? So I wrote the story first for the New York Times Magazine, and I wrote it, in a more traditional style for long-form journalism. But I always had this secret hope that I would get to write it in a different way, in a way that would involve and challenge the reader. And one of the things that I really wanted was for the reader to feel what it felt like to me to be involved in this story from the beginning to the end. And I had a lot of sleepless nights while I was reporting this story, because I didn't know how it was going to turn out. Sasha was in the hospital and Richard was incarcerated, and I did not know whether either of them would be okay. And so I wanted the reader to have that feeling too, to know what it was like to care that much about these two young people, and to feel care and concern and compassion for them, regardless of what opinions you might have started out with.
There are many themes in your book. What do you think is the most important theme for the readers to understand and why?
So the question is, what's the most important theme of the book? Yeah, I get asked this question a lot, sometimes by email, by somebody who's clearly facing a Monday deadline for a paper they're supposed to write for school. And I always say, that's up to you as a reader. Whatever you got out of it is the most important theme. But one thing that I really hope people do get out of it is that life is more complicated than it first appears. We live in this time of instant judgment, particularly on social media, but just kind of in general. We are very fast to throw opinions at things about which we may not know very much. And so if there's anything I hope people get out of it, it is that your opinion is not the most important thing. In fact, it's okay to never have an opinion about something, to just be like, I don't know enough to have an opinion, and to be just curious to know more, curious about other people who are unlike you and whose lives might have traveled a different path than yours, and that there's always more to the story.
Did your own perspective or opinion change as a result of researching and then writing this book?
Yeah, so the question is, did my own opinion or perspective change in the course of writing this book? Absolutely. I, on a number of things. First of all, I mentioned that I really was pretty ignorant on the subject of gender when I started out. And so that, like, a whole world opened up to me as Sasha took me through their own gender journey and pointed me to all these resources and things that they had read. So absolutely, that was something that I was kind of unfamiliar with, and that has, changed my whole way of looking at the world. Similarly, my understanding of justice was a long-standing exploration, but one of the things that I really came away with much more clarity on is the way in which young people are neurologically different from adults, and how important it is to have a system that honors that very important difference between young people and adults if we want to have better outcomes in the future.
What kind of impact do you think and hope your book can have on research?
So the question is, what kind of impact do I hope my book will have? I get a lot of letters from readers, which I love. And my two favorite, well, okay, I have three favorite kinds. I like them all, except for the ones that were really obviously written for school, which are fine. Good job for doing your homework, but they're like, but the ones where people did feel like they took something away, I love. I love ones when people say, I'm now uncertain, or I don't know what to think, because to me, that is such an uncomfortable place to live. And it's a place that I spent a lot of my life in. So I love it when people say, like, now I just don't know what to think. Good. It's, like, certainty is really kind of a dead place, and uncertainty is a place where lots of growth and change can happen. I also love when people say that they feel different about gender, that they used to think that there were only two genders, and to mock people who identified someplace else on the gender spectrum. And I love when people say they changed for them. And I love when people say that they are thinking about the criminal justice system differently, and particularly when anybody says, I want to get involved.
Is there anything that you would go back to differently in terms of collecting the research or in the writing of the story?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot. It's a great question, and I always wish that I had a better answer for it. But the truth is, I wrote the book that I wanted to write. And there were things that I didn't get because somebody wasn't willing to be interviewed, or didn't want to be in the book. And so there are things that I would love to have been able to include if I had been able to get enough material to back them up, and I couldn't. So that's always disappointing, but there's nothing I could do about that. That's just life. Not everybody wants to be in a book. And there are things that have changed. The language around gender and sex and romantic inclination and all of that is constantly evolving, and probably the next edition, when the book finally comes out on paperback, some of those things will be updated. But I'm always looking forward to the next thing that I'm doing, and I tend not to go back and and rewrite in my mind something that's done. Yeah, there's not a lot that I would change.
Well, on behalf of Napa High School, we can't thank you enough for your time and your amazing story that you've shared with us today. I will offer it back to Kate McMillan to close this out. But again, Dashka, Slater, thank you so much for writing an amazing story that our students have learned so much from. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for your great questions.
So this, Kate, will go ahead and close this out. Oh, wonderful. We have Miss Reddy here. Thank you.
Dashka, thank you so much from Napa Unified School District for being a part of our author series, to the team who made this happen today, to from behind the scenes with Megan, to our amazing library service team under Kate McMillan, and our students here and our teachers. We just appreciate you, appreciate the audiences out there, and thank you so much for sharing this story with us. So.